Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Think about a rescue at sea for a second. Imagine you are drowning in the middle of a freezing ocean.
Oh, that is a terrifying situation for anyone to be in.
It really is. Your lungs are burning, the salt water is choking you, and the sheer weight of the waves is pulling you under the surface. You have absolutely nothing left in the tank.
You are completely helpless at that point, just waiting for the end.
Yes, completely helpless. But suddenly, a rescuer hauls you up onto the steel deck of a ship. You are violently shivering, coughing up seawater, absolutely freezing to the bone, and unable to stand.
Wow, so you are safe, but you are still in terrible shape.
Right. And then the rescuer looks down at you, smiles, and says, "Congratulations, you are pardoned from drowning," and then he just turns around and walks away.
He just leaves you there. That is awful.
He leaves you on the cold steel deck with no dry clothes, no medical attention, no food, and no heat. Now, avoiding the bottom of the ocean is fantastic, but leaving a person sick, freezing, and helpless on the deck is a massively incomplete picture of salvation, isn't it?
It really is. It is a half rescue.
Today, we are taking a deep dive into the sources, specifically looking at two incredibly rigorous theological essays, Providence and the blood-bought zeal for good works, and the efficacious purchase.
Those are some heavy titles, but the content inside them is incredible.
They really are. Our mission for this session is to unpack a massive theological claim. These sources argue that the cross of Jesus Christ did not just buy forgiveness for sins, but it purchased the actual lived-out obedience of the believer.
Which is a huge distinction to make.
We are going to look closely at how divine providence uses grace to train the Christian to possess a burning zeal for good works.
That image of the half rescue gets right to the core of the issue we are investigating today. Modern Christianity frequently splits the ticket.
What do you mean by splitting the ticket?
Well, what I mean by that is you often hear a presentation of the gospel that offers a savior who freely pardons your guilt. But then it leaves you completely on your own to figure out your obedience, your habits, and your daily holiness.
Ah, so you get the pardon, but no help with the actual living part.
Precisely. It is presented as a transaction where the debt is canceled, but the rebel is left comfortably wallowing in his rebellion. The sources we are looking at today make a staggering claim about that.
And what is that claim?
They argue that this split ticket is a false gospel. It is utterly foreign to the apostolic witness. The cross was never designed to be a simple amnesty program.
Right. It was designed to be the forge of our sanctification.
Yes, the thesis before us is that Christ purchased more than an escape from hell. He purchased the very obedience he demands from his people.
Before we start opening up specific Bible passages, we need to define our major terms according to the sources. We want to make sure you, the listener, understand the scale of this discussion.
Setting the definitions early on is always a good idea.
We have to start with the concept of providence. According to the Westminster Confession, providence is God upholding, directing, disposing, and governing all creatures' actions and things, from the greatest even to the least.
That is a very comprehensive list.
It is, and our sources point out that this is not some cold mechanical force running the universe in the background. It's not like a clockmaker who winds up the clock and goes on vacation.
Right, and it is not passive foresight either. God does not just look down the corridor of time, watch what humans decide to do, and then react to it.
No, providence is the holy, wise, and loving government of a father. When we apply this specifically to salvation, it means God decrees the end goal, which is your glorification.
But he also ordains the precise means to get you there.
Yes, those means include his commands, his warnings, his discipline, his comforts, and the local church. God does not bring his elect from conversion to glory by leaving them spiritually idle on a cold steel deck.
That definition changes everything about how you view your daily life. If providence is the holy government of the Father applying the benefits of the cross to you, then your sanctification is not an independent project.
You are definitely not doing it alone.
The sources quote Charles Haddon Spurgeon here. He said that the blood of Christ was shed not only to save us from the punishment of sin, but to save us from the dominion of sin.
That is a fantastic quote.
It really hits the mark. God requires obedience from his people, and by the blood of the eternal covenant, he makes that obedience certain.
I think St. Augustine articulated this beautifully when he prayed, "Command what you will and grant what you command."
Yes. The massive error of modern evangelicalism is compartmentalizing justification and sanctification.
We tend to view justification being declared righteous in the courtroom of God as God's work alone.
But then we view sanctification growing in daily holiness as our independent effort aided loosely by the Spirit. The sources violently reject this separation.
They assert that practical holiness, the good fruit that validates the nature of the tree, is a purchased reality.
It was obtained for God's elect people by the blood of his only begotten Son.
I want to introduce another analogy to make this idea of a purchased reality concrete, because it is so easy to miss.
I love a good analogy. Let's hear it.
Imagine a great king deciding to pardon a treasonous rebel. The king issues a royal decree of pardon, but leaves the rebel sitting in the mud of his dark prison cell.
Wearing filthy rags, no doubt.
Wearing filthy rags, and still holding on to his inward hatred for the crown. That is half a rescue. He is legally pardoned, sure, but he is still a rebel in his heart.
According to these essays, the cross does much more than that legal transaction.
The cross is the king pardoning the rebel, bringing him up from the dungeon, washing him, and outfitting him with shining armor.
He brings him into the royal guard, too.
Right, and he gives him a burning, unquenchable desire to fight for the crown. It is a complete change of nature.
That makes the concept so much clearer for the listener.
Now, theology happens in real life, not in a vacuum. I want to transition to the historical settings the apostles were actually writing to.
That is crucial. Context is everything.
How did this radical idea of purchased holiness land in the ancient world? Let's look at the setting of the book of Titus.
Paul is writing to a young pastor stationed on the island of Crete.
Crete was, by all historical accounts, a moral cesspool. The text quotes the Cretan poet Epimenides, who declared, "Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons."
You have to laugh thinking about putting that on the island's welcome brochure. You certainly would not get much tourism with a slogan like that.
Definitely not. But the Greco-Roman backdrop to these letters is staggering when you comprehend what the early church was actually up against.
The Roman Empire was characterized by rampant idolatry, unspeakable debauchery, infanticide, and sophisticated philosophies.
Those philosophies elevated the sensual appetites of the flesh to the status of a divine right.
The pagan gods did not demand inward holiness at all. Their deities were as corrupt, greedy, and capricious as the men who invented them.
So when the gospel arrived in a place like Crete, a simple behavior modification program would completely fail against that kind of deep cultural rot.
You cannot just tell an evil beast to start acting nicely and expect it to work.
The apostles were not offering a new philosophy of respectability or a 10-step program to a better life. They were offering a sovereign force of redemption that fundamentally altered human nature.
We see a similar intense environment in the setting of 1 Peter. Peter writes to elect exiles who are facing the rising tide of Neronian persecution.
They were dealing with the threat of violent death, social ostracization, and total economic ruin.
In that context, a cheap, superficial faith would instantly collapse under the Roman sword.
Peter had to call to mind that they were ransomed from the feudal ways inherited from their forefathers.
He was driving a stake through the heart of the empty, dead-end, idolatrous traditions of their pagan ancestors.
Honestly, reading this part of the sources, I felt a little defensive for these early Christians.
How so?
Well, if grace covers all their sins, and these people lived in such intense, hostile environments where they could literally be tortured or killed for their faith, why did Paul and Peter push so hard on their daily behavior?
That is a very fair question to ask.
Why not just let them be forgiven Cretans surviving under the radar? Give them a break. Why demand such visible, costly holiness from people who are already under so much cultural pressure?
That is a completely natural reaction. It feels like the apostles are piling massive expectations onto people who are already getting crushed.
Right, it feels heavy.
But Paul constructs his argument in Titus chapter 2 to answer that precise concern. He shows that behavior is demanded because grace has appeared, not in spite of it.
Okay, let's look at the literary flow of Titus chapter 2 then.
It moves directly from the indicative to the imperative. First, Paul gives household instructions to various groups. He addresses older men, younger women, and slaves.
He tells them to live with absolute reverence and self-control.
But he does not leave those commands hanging in the air as an impossible burden. He grounds them in verse 11 with the word "for."
So he gives the reason.
Yes, for the grace of God has appeared. Grace is presented here as a divine tutor. The text describes grace training us.
So it is actively teaching them.
It teaches a negative lesson, which is renouncing ungodliness and worldly passions. And it teaches a positive lesson, which is living self-controlled, upright, and godly lives.
Then we get to the Greek exegesis of verse 14, which is crucial. Paul says Christ gave himself to redeem us. The Greek word is litro.
That was a socially charged word in the ancient world.
Right. It referred to the payment of a ransom to free a slave or a prisoner of war.
Christ pays the ransom to liberate us from all lawlessness. He buys us off the auction block of sin.
And then he acts to purify us using the Greek word katharisy.
The intended result of this redemption and purification is to create a people zealous for good works.
Wait, that word zealous there, isn't that related to the political zealots of the first century? The guys with the daggers?
Yes, that is spot on. Well, let me phrase that better. Yes, it is precisely the same root.
That is wild to think about.
The text unpacks the Greek word zotios. It shares a root with the political zealots of the first century. Those were the revolutionaries who fought Roman rule with fierce, violent devotion.
And God takes that burning, unyielding passion and redirects it toward righteous works.
This is completely contrary to reluctant, minimal compliance. We are not talking about a Christian asking, how close can I get to the line of sin without crossing it?
We are talking about eager affection. The grace of God creates a people who are aggressively pursuing good works. That is fascinating. So it is not a reluctant trudge toward morality. It is a burning desire for it.
Yes, it is a total change of heart.
I also want to point out the phrase, in the present age, from Titus 2. We are not allowed to postpone our obedience until we reach heaven.
God knows the precise cultural pressure of the present age you are living in.
And his grace is fully sufficient to train you right in the middle of it. You do not get a pass because the culture around you is wicked.
So true.
So Paul is dealing with a specific crisis in Crete. But did he invent this idea of a heart change? Or is he just pulling from an older playbook? Because this sounds a lot like what the Old Testament prophets were begging for.
You are right on the money. Moving into the next major section of our sources, the authors show how this concept is the massive fulfillment of Old Testament promises.
Which proves a unified biblical narrative.
Paul is not inventing anything new. He is announcing the arrival of what was promised. We have to look at the new covenant promise in Jeremiah chapter 31.
Verses 31 through 34. This is the famous passage where God promises to write the law on the heart.
The text highlights the Hebrew conjunction key in verse 34, which translates to for or because.
The clause reads, "For I will forgive their iniquity."
That conjunction demonstrates that forgiveness is the structural base. It is the absolute prerequisite for the internal writing of the law.
Until the guilt of sin is definitively dealt with, there can be no internal renovation of the heart.
Forgiveness paves the way for holiness. We see this identical logic in Romans chapter 8, verses 3 and 4.
Paul writes that God condemns sin in the flesh.
Our sources focus on the Greek "haina" clause there, which means in order that. God condemns sin in the flesh in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us.
The penal substitution on the cross had a targeted aim.
Christ became the lightning rod for divine justice, suffering the condemnation our lawless deeds demanded. He did this so that practical obedience, which is love, would become a reality in our lives.
Then, in Hebrews chapter 9, we see the contrast between the blood of bulls and goats, which only cleansed the flesh externally, and the unblemished blood of Christ.
Christ's blood reaches down and cleanses the conscience from dead works, so the believer can actively worship the living God.
I have another way to think about this transition from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant to make it practical.
Go for it. Analogies really help ground this stuff.
The Old Covenant sacrifices were like taking a painkiller for a massive brain tumor.
That sounds like a temporary fix.
Right. The blood of bulls and goats masked the issue temporarily, and it provided a temporary reprieve, but it did not cure the disease. The patient was still fundamentally sick, still dying from the inside out.
But the new covenant is different.
The new covenant blood of Christ is the successful surgical operation. It completely removes the tumor, and it totally rehabilitates the patient's mind. The disease of lawlessness is cut out, and a new heart of flesh is put in.
That is a very vivid way to understand it.
Now, if the grammar and the history of the Bible make this so explicitly clear, how does the modern church get this so wrong?
The sources identify two massive ditches that people constantly fall into when trying to make sense of grace and works.
What is the first ditch?
The first ditch is legalism. This is the belief that your works buy your redemption.
The texts completely refute this by stating that works are the fruit, not the price, of salvation.
In the first century, the Jewish Judaizers tried to chain believers to external ceremonies. They argued that sanctification came through rigorous keeping of Mosaic ordinances.
They wanted to add human effort to the finished work of Christ.
But the cross destroys that. You cannot buy what has already been purchased.
Okay, so that is the first ditch. What is the second?
The second ditch on the opposite side of the road is antinomianism. This is the belief that free pardon makes obedience optional.
It is the idea that because grace covers my sin, I can live however I want.
The apostolic texts furiously reject this concept of cheap grace. They state unequivocally that the cross liberates us from lawlessness, not to lawlessness.
The sources call out several modern trends that fall into these ditches. They critique seeker-sensitive pragmatism, which desires church growth without requiring any real holiness.
They also call out mysticism, which seeks emotional impressions over the solid rock of Scripture.
They blast the prosperity gospel, which ignores the cross entirely in favor of earthly comfort and wealth.
And they challenge the Arminian view, which reduces the cross to a hypothetical option. That view makes salvation dependent on fallen human will, rather than an efficacious purchase made by the Son of God.
I want to ask you, the listener, to do a self-audit right now based on what we are discussing. How can you tell which ditch you are leaning toward?
That is a great exercise for everyone.
Are you anxious all the time, trying to buy God's favor by checking boxes, reading your Bible out of guilt, and performing religious duties to keep God happy with you?
If so, you are leaning toward legalism. You do not believe the purchase was sufficient.
Or are you apathetic, using grace as a cover for laziness and cherished sins, thinking God does not care how you live as long as you prayed a prayer once?
If so, you are leaning heavily into antinomianism. You want the pardon, but you do not want the purity.
So how do we stay out of those ditches? The texts point to a specific mechanism God uses to sustain our zeal, and that mechanism is hope.
We're living between two appearings.
Grace has appeared in the first coming of Christ, and glory will appear at the second coming.
Titus 2, verse 13 says, "We are waiting for our blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ."
We need to break down how this eschatological hope works practically in your daily life, because it is not just a theological concept.
Right. It is a highly functional mechanism.
How does thinking about the return of Christ actually stop someone from snapping at their spouse or cheating on their taxes?
Here's how it works. Hope guards against despair when holiness feels impossible, and it guards against worldliness when compromise feels easy.
Why cling to a private lust or seek the fleeting applause of the earth when the Holy One is returning in blazing glory?
The Christian ethic is future-facing. We do not obey because the present age rewards us. Often it does the exact opposite.
We obey because Christ is coming, his glory will be revealed, and his appearing will vindicate every labor of faith.
This hope purifies because it reorders human desire around the certainty of Christ's triumph. If Christ is coming, sin is not worth keeping.
If Christ is coming, suffering is not the final word. It fundamentally shifts your risk-reward calculus.
The text mentions something incredibly beautiful here. Hidden obedience is never wasted.
That is a massive comfort. The present age mocks holiness and rewards compromise. You might be making quiet, difficult choices in your home or your workplace to honor God, and nobody sees it.
Or worse, you get passed over for a promotion because of your integrity, while the guy who lies and cuts corners gets the corner office.
But the glorious return of Christ will vindicate every single quiet, difficult choice made in faith. Let's bring this lofty theology down to your daily reality right now.
The texts present 4 areas of action. We have doctrinal, pastoral, repentant, and corporate action.
Let's start with the doctrinal. Believers must reshape their thinking to see holiness not as an optional accessory for serious Christians, but as the guaranteed, blood-bought reality of salvation.
Pastorally, there's massive encouragement for the struggling believer. If you mourn your sin, look back to the cross. Your security is not based on your own willpower, but on the finished work of Christ.
Then there is repentant action, which is a call to actively renounce cherished sins, private lust, bitterness, prayerlessness, or entertainment that feeds corruption.
And finally, corporate action. Churches must cultivate zeal as a mark of health. Confessional orthodoxy should produce burning devotion, not frozen, academic hearts.
Good works adorn the gospel doctrine in front of watching neighbors.
That is a brilliant summary of the application points. But I know what some listeners might be thinking when they hear this heavy push for a zeal for good works.
Right, because sometimes that push leads people straight into massive exhaustion.
It definitely can.
How do we differentiate between burning out on your own strength versus operating in this blood-bought zeal? If I am supposed to be zealous, but I am just tired, what is going wrong?
That is the crucial question. The sources answer this by focusing heavily on our union with Christ and relying on the Spirit's application of grace.
This cuts the nerve of human boasting entirely.
If you are burning out, you are likely trying to manufacture holiness from your fallen nature. You are operating on what theologians call Adamic willpower, the natural fleshly strength you inherited from Adam.
You are trying to generate zeal through natural temperament or sheer willpower, just gritting your teeth and trying to be a better person.
Blood-bought zeal relies on the reality that the same Lord who commands the zeal has purchased the zeal. It is the flame kindled by a crucified and risen Christ.
We rest in his finished work, and then we labor as one whose labor is not in vain. We work hard, yes, but we work with the energy that he mightily provides.
That makes total sense. It is the difference between trying to push a car up a hill by yourself versus turning the key and letting the engine do the work.
To summarize our core thesis today, the God who decrees your salvation also orchestrates the means to make you holy. The blood of Christ is the most active, purifying agent in the universe.
It does not just cancel your debt, it purchases your new heart and your eager obedience.
I want to leave you with a final, provocative challenge to ponder. The sources say God's providence places you in your exact home, your exact church, your specific work, and your unique trials as the training ground for your grace.
What if the most frustrating part of your current season, that difficult coworker, the hidden health struggle, the massive financial stress, is not a distraction from your spiritual life?
What if that frustration is the precise classroom God is using right now to forge your blood-bought zeal?
Think back to the freezing man pulled onto the deck of the ship. Christ does not leave you shivering in your lawlessness.
He outfits you for the battle and gives you the fire to fight it. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the sources.